Writing. She grabbed my hand at the airport and whispered, "Please, just trust me." The airport was packed that morning, but I noticed her because she looked like someone running out of time. She stood in the middle of the terminal with rain still shining on her coat, her eyes moving desperately across the crowd. Then she saw me. Before I could understand what was happening, she hurried toward me, grabbed my hand, and whispered that I had to pretend I was the person she had been waiting for. I had never seen her before, yet something about the fear in her eyes made me stay. My name is Daniel, and until that morning, my biggest problem had been deciding whether I could afford to take a few days off work. I repaired aircraft equipment for a living, which meant airports had never felt romantic or mysterious to me. They were simply places filled with schedules, announcements, delays, and exhausted travelers. I had spent most of my adult life keeping my head down and working hard. My father had taught me that if you wanted something, you earned it. My mother had taught me that if someone needed help, you gave it without immediately asking what you would receive in return. That morning, I was waiting for a flight to another city because my younger sister had been hospitalized unexpectedly. I was anxious, distracted, and checking my phone when the woman appeared. She was dressed elegantly, but her expression didn't match her appearance. Her hands were trembling. She glanced over her shoulder several times before looking at me again. She quietly explained that someone was following her and that she needed a few minutes to get somewhere safe. She didn't ask me to fight anyone or do anything dangerous. She only wanted me to stay beside her and act as though we knew each other until airport security could help. I hesitated. There are moments when your brain gives you 100 reasons to walk away. This was one of them. But then I noticed something else. She wasn't afraid of losing money. She was afraid of being found. If you believe kindness, courage, and second chances can change someone's life, please like this story, share it with someone who needs encouragement, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories. I stayed beside her. We walked toward the information desk while she quietly explained that her name was Claire. She had been scheduled to leave the country that morning, but she had discovered that someone close to her family was attempting to take control of a charitable organization her late mother had created. Claire had found financial records that didn't make sense. When she confronted the people involved, she was told to stop asking questions. She hadn't known whom to trust. So she had come to the airport intending to disappear for a while. But someone had followed her. When we reached the security area, Claire finally relaxed enough to tell an officer what was happening. Security reviewed the cameras and confirmed that 2 men had been following her through the terminal. The men were questioned and eventually escorted away while the authorities began investigating the situation. Claire looked at me with tears in her eyes and thanked me. I expected that to be the end. It wasn't. My flight was delayed, and Claire's departure had been cancelled while authorities investigated. We ended up sitting several seats apart in the same waiting area. Neither of us knew what to say. Eventually, she asked about the suitcase beside me. I told her I was traveling to see my sister. Claire immediately apologized for taking up my time. I told her that my sister was more important than any flight schedule. Something changed in her expression. She told me about her mother. Her mother had spent decades using the family's wealth to build medical centers for people who couldn't afford treatment. After her death, Claire had promised to protect that work. But the more she investigated, the more she realized that several executives were quietly redirecting money away from the foundation. She had been trying to expose them alone. That was her mistake. She had money, but she didn't have trust. I understood that feeling more than she expected. My own family had struggled financially after my father lost his job. I'd watched my mother work double shifts while pretending everything was fine. I'd learned early that having people around you wasn't the same as having people you could depend on. Claire looked at me and said she wished she could return to the moment before everything became complicated. I told her that sometimes the hardest chapters of life were the ones that forced people to discover who they really were. She smiled sadly. Then she asked whether I believed people could change. I said yes. Not because everyone changed, but because some people finally realized they had something worth changing for. A few hours later, I received a call from the hospital. My sister's condition had improved, and the doctors expected her to recover. For the first time that day, I could breathe. Claire smiled when she saw the relief on my face. Before we separated, she handed me a card and told me to call if I ever needed anything. I never expected to use it. 3 months later, I received an invitation to the opening of a new community medical center. Claire's name was on the invitation. So was my sister's. I discovered that Claire had used part of her family's foundation to expand medical assistance for ordinary families. The center had a special program for people who couldn't afford emergency treatment. My sister had become one of the first patients helped through the program. I called Claire immediately. She told me she hadn't done it because she owed me anything. She had done it because our brief conversation at the airport had reminded her why her mother had created the foundation. People were more important than money. A year passed. The people who had been stealing from the foundation were prosecuted. Claire took control of the charity, but she changed the way it operated. She created an independent board so no single person could ever secretly control the money again. I continued repairing aircraft equipment. My sister recovered completely. And Claire and I remained close friends. People sometimes assume that the most important relationships begin with perfect circumstances. Ours began in confusion, fear, and uncertainty. There was no grand plan. No carefully written introduction. Just two strangers meeting at the wrong place at the right time. One rainy evening, Claire and I stood outside the same airport where everything had begun. Planes were lifting into the dark sky, their lights disappearing into the clouds. She looked at the terminal and laughed softly, remembering how frightened she had been. I told her that if she hadn't grabbed my hand that morning, I probably would have spent the entire day worrying about my sister and never noticed what was happening around me. She said that was exactly why she had chosen me. I asked what she meant. She explained that everyone around her seemed to see her family name first. I had been the first person who simply saw a frightened woman who needed help. That was all. And sometimes, that is enough to change a life. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps these stories reach people who need a reminder that one small act of kindness can travel much farther than we ever imagine. And before the ending, comment, "I would have stopped to help," if you believe we should never ignore someone simply because their problems aren't our own. Years later, Claire's foundation had helped thousands of families. My sister became a nurse. And I still sometimes think about that morning at the airport. A stranger grabbed my hand because she was afraid. I held on because I believed she deserved to feel safe. Neither of us knew that a few seconds of kindness would become one of the most important moments of our lives. Sometimes destiny doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it simply reaches through a crowded room, takes your hand, and asks you not to walk away.